Good morning. This is Chris with TenantCloud here. If you can hear my audio, if you could go ahead and just hit one of those emojis down at the bottom of your screen. If you can see my screen, this little button right here. Awesome. Fantastic. Just want to make sure you can hear me. It says that y'all should be able to hear me, but sometimes you never know. Sometimes it's the audio can be weird on these webinar platforms. All right. So can you hear me, Lisa? Can you hear me? Hello, hello. All right. So this is a presentation this morning that we're going to get into the topic of screenings. And if you've attended any of our webinars in the past, you will know that we try to keep it between 30 to 45 minutes with a period of time afterwards to answer any questions that may have come up during the presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to post them in the chat thread in the right side that everybody looks like everybody's pretty much found it over there. If you could just go ahead and post your questions there as they come up, and that way at the end of the presentation, we can go ahead and discuss some of those questions you may have come up. Just keep in mind that this particular presentation, none of our presentations are rocket science. There's very little in property management that has to do with rocket science. And really what we try to accomplish in a lot of these webinars is to touch on some of the strategies that can be used, some of the tools that can be used, and also just brush up on a lot of the things that we should all probably be doing anyway. So it may not be necessarily anything new to you per se, but it's always good, and for myself included, to always get a refresher course on a lot of things that maybe I forgot about, or maybe I've been slacking on, or just things that have been falling through the cracks. And also feel free to share any of this information with your team members as well. This presentation is recorded, and you will be able to use the same link that you used to join this presentation to come back to it at a later time. Usually it's back up and running within about 10 or 15 minutes after the presentation has ended. Then the recording is accessible. We also tend to upload these webinars and presentations to our TenantCloud YouTube channel. So if you want to view previous webinars or listen to our podcast or any other type of information that you want to view in terms of video or audio content, all of that is pretty much on our TenantCloud YouTube channel. In fact, I think we have over 150 or 200 videos on our TenantCloud YouTube channel at this point. And I think our podcast has something like 100 podcasts now as well. And we have picked up our 2023 season on the podcast. So we are releasing a podcast usually every month for the time being. So during this particular season. So again, thanks for joining. I know it is a busy time of the month, and hopefully you are not missing out on anything major by joining this webinar, and hopefully the information we share will be beneficial to you. I do want to jump in right away and show you on my screen here. This is the TenantCloud dashboard. This was recently revamped. If you haven't logged in a while, this is the new look for the dashboard that they just recently redid. And if you want to do a screening, the tool in TenantCloud is to come into your applications tab on the left side menu, and you can click view application for any applications you've had come through, and click right here to request a screening report. And you can either have the tenant pay for it, or you can pay for it if they've already paid you like an application fee or something through the TenantCloud platform. There's also a third option when you're actually going to list the actual unit as a rental online, to set it up to where the applicant actually pays for the screening right then and there at the same time that they apply, so that you get both a copy of their application and their screening results simultaneously. However, we're going to go into a few things about why it's probably better to just not charge or not have them pay for a screening right away and have that come through, even though you have that ability in TenantCloud. We're going to go over some strategies as to why you might want them to just submit the application and then you request the screening report after the fact. So if you're already doing that, that's great. But we're just going to touch on some of the strategies as to why that is usually recommended. So Just want to make sure everybody can, again, see my screen. And when I switched over to this tab, everybody saw the TenantCloud tab, just to make sure that you're able to see all the stuff on my screen. If you can hit the emoji button and just let me know. Awesome. Cool. Just want to make sure my screen share is working. So we're going to jump right into the presentation. The presentation is Trust But Verify, Navigating the Landscape of Rental Screenings. And for anybody who's been in the property management industry for any amount of time knows that the one thing that can make or break your rental business, especially if you are a small one and can't afford to take a lot of losses, then the rental application process is essential to the success of your rental management business, because getting the wrong tenant into your property could be extremely detrimental. Just to get started, the disclaimer is the information provided in this article is for general informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice or relied upon as a substitute for professional legal guidance. The content of this article may not reflect the most current legal developments or regulations. The legal developments and regulations in your region may also vary from those on a national level or from other regions. There's going to be a topic or two we're going to touch on where it will change sometimes dramatically from one state or even city to another. So just want to make sure you are aware of that. Landlords and individuals involved in rental screening should consult with qualified legal professionals regarding the specific circumstances and any legal questions or concerns they may have. And while we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we make no representations or warranties of any kind, express or implied, about the completeness, accuracy, reliability, suitability, or availability with respect to the article or the information, products, services, or related graphics contained in the article. Any reliance you place on such information is strictly at your own risk. Therefore, we disclaim any liability for any reliance on the information provided in this article. I realize that was a mouthful. However, just want to make sure that you understand the importance of screenings and the importance that you are following not just federal laws, but also state and regional, because they do change for a lot of people. And so if you're not aware of any variances in your state or your city, you will definitely want to check on that, because not every area strictly adheres to just federal law. Some are actually even more strict than federal law on the state level when it comes to screenings. So the introduction is, as a landlord, finding the right tenant is crucial for maintaining a successful and hassle-free rental property. And the vital tool, I would say it's probably the most vital tool above all else, is tenant screening. It's important to verify information that is provided, especially in this day and age of fake pay stubs and proof of income, which, if you have not experienced that yet, congratulations, you are probably one of the few, and it will eventually come across your desk one of these days. So it's important to be aware of that. It's also important to be able to navigate the fair housing laws and what you are able to do and not able to do, and best practices along those lines. Tenant screening serves multiple purposes and offers numerous benefits to landlords. And here are some of the key reasons why screening prospective tenants is vital. Some you've probably thought of, and maybe some you haven't. The first one, of course, is financial security, which is renting a property involves a financial commitment for both parties, not just you, but also for your tenant. And so it's important that you are able to assess your applicant's financial stability, including their credit history and income verification. Someone may have fantastic credit, but perhaps they recently lost their job and are not communicating that to you and really can't afford your rental at this time. Or maybe they don't have a good history of managing their money, even though they make a lot, and therefore their credit may be impacted by that. So this helps you to evaluate and make sure that your tenants have the means to meet the obligations under your lease contract. The property protection is one of the important things of tenant screenings. Protecting the property from potential damage is a major concern for landlords. By screening tenants, landlords can gauge an applicant's rental history and identify any instances of property damage or neglect. One of the things that it's become a little less common these days, but at least with major property management companies. But what we used to do we would send out a rental verification form to prior rentals that came up on a rental screening. So, for instance, if you have an applicant who applies for your rental property, then their background or credit check is likely going to list prior addresses. And hopefully, the applicant has also listed those on the application. If they have not, that might be a red flag because maybe they aren't listing a prior rental property they stayed at for a reason. And so, what we would do is we would compare the rental screening addresses for prior residences to their application to make sure that they lined up. If they didn't line up, that again was a caution flag for us. And maybe we wanted to dig in and find a little more information about that. One of the things that we would do is we would send a rental verification form to those prior landlords or to property management companies and see if they would fill them out and provide basic information. Now, there is a lot of information that you cannot ask a prior landlord, nor should you ask. And there's some information that you can ask, but a prior landlord may not fill out or answer for whatever reason. However, one of the questions that we almost always included on our rental verification requests was, do they owe you any money? Did they cause any damage beyond normal wear and tear in the rental property? And depending on those answers from the prior landlord and, of course, their overall rental screening would determine whether or not we would A, approve them, or B, if we would require an additional security deposit to cover any potential damages that may occur while they are renting your property. So, something to keep in mind is property protection as a part of your rental screenings. And it's not necessarily something that shows up on the rental screening that says, hey, this tenant owes $375 because they broke something on the door at this other property and they had to replace the entire door and casing of the door because they kicked it down or whatever because of a domestic dispute. The report won't necessarily say that. That amount may not have ever been reported by the prior landlord or property management company, and so it won't show up on their credit report. And so there is information that will not necessarily show up. But again, if they have prior addresses listed on their screening that don't match what comes up on their application that they filled out, that may be something you want to look into. Rental agreement compliance, lease violations. Tenant screening allows landlords to evaluate an applicant's background, including criminal history. This step ensures that potential tenants do not pose a threat to the safety of other residents or the property itself. Again, you can pull reports and you can also send a rental verification to the prior landlord and ask, has this tenant had any lease violations under their previous lease? Some landlords will answer, some landlords won't. But again, it's something that may be worth asking on that rental verification form because, again, this is not information that's necessarily going to show up on their background check unless there was some type of police involvement in it and they were perhaps arrested or charged, even if they weren't ever ultimately convicted, etc. There may be information on the screening that reveals that there might be an issue with rental agreement compliance, but not typically. Avoiding legal issues. Proper tenant screening mitigates legal risks for landlords. By assessing an applicant's background, landlords can identify any red flags related to evictions, legal disputes, or fraudulent activity. And if you make sure that you are doing a screening for every single potential applicant at your rental property and you are treating them all equally and fairly across the board, and you're not allowing one person with one issue approved for your rental property, but you allow somebody else with that same or similar issue, that could be a red flag that could cause legal risks for you as a landlord if you fall or your property falls under fair housing guidelines. So this is something that is becoming a kind of a hot topic in the property management industry. And if you haven't been paying attention to it, you definitely want to, because even some cities are starting to crack down on what you are allowed to make decisions on based on criminal history, because some would argue that if somebody has already served time for a crime, then that should not be held against them for something as basic as housing. And so there's arguments both ways, but regardless, it is proceeding with in the form of city ordinances and even state laws that are starting to come about as a result of that heated debate. So it's important to stay on top of it and be aware of what you are required to abide by in your decision-making processes when you are doing tenant screenings for background checks. In fact, there are some areas that you cannot even do a background check first, or you can't do a credit check first. You have to do one first, and then you have to make a decision. Then you can get the other information. And there's some places where you're not allowed to get any of the information about their criminal history, because again, the assumption is if they're back on the street, then they are allowed to rent a roof over their head. So again, just something to stay on top of for your specific area. Selecting tenants who align with the property's values and expectations leads to positive and lasting landlord-tenant relationships. Through screening, landlords can identify responsible, respectful, and considerate individuals. This not only promotes tenant satisfaction, but also reduces turnover rates and increases the likelihood of timely rent payments. If you are able to do background checks in your area and you're able to make the typical decisions that you've been able to make in the past, then generally it allows for a better overall tenant-landlord relationship with other tenants and with the new tenants coming in. If you have somebody, for instance, who has a history of dealing drugs or even manufacturing drugs, and they have continuously been convicted of that same thing over and over again, then of course that shows a trend that that's not likely to change anytime soon, including at your rental property, which could of course start causing issues at your rental property. I've had that very same issue at one of my rental properties years ago, and it's a lot more difficult to resolve than what you may think once the person is inside the rental property. So definitely something to keep in mind, that if you are not currently doing criminal background checks, it may be something worth looking into if you're allowed to for your area. Moving on to the essential components of a rental screening. To conduct effective tenant screening, landlords should consider the following essential components. Number one, we already touched on some of these, but we're just going to dive in a little bit deeper to some of these. A credit check is evaluating their financial responsibility. Now, again, there are arguments one way or the other that credit reports don't necessarily, a credit score necessarily isn't the deciding factor of whether a tenant is a good tenant or not, or if they're going to pay their rent on time or not, which is why a lot of screening tools have started to create what they have called tenant scores. There's different names for it, but basically that's what it comes down to. It's more of a score that's designed to tell you, is this tenant, does their financial scenario, their situation, their circumstances, does it line up to being a better tenant? Not necessarily just credit worthiness in general, but are they going to default on their rent if they lose their job or their income changes, or they go through a divorce and their income level changes for the rental property? Is this person going to default on their rental, or are they going to default on their car note or whatever? And so tenant scores tend to be more accurate in terms of deciding whether or not a credit check on a tenant reveals information that would prove them to be a poor tenant versus a good tenant. And so that's one of the things that our screening product does, is it gives TransUnion generates a tenant score, which is supposed to give a level of indication or confidence in the idea that this tenant is going to pay their rent on time and be a good tenant for your rental property. So depending on the product that you're currently using, a typical FICO score may not necessarily be the best indicator of whether or not that tenant is going to be a quality tenant and meet their financial obligations under the lease contract. Conducting a background check helps landlords gather information about an applicant's criminal history. And this could involve not only the well-being and safety for yourself, but also the well-being and safety of the property and other tenants. Having a repeated repeatedly convicted arson may not be a good idea for your rental property. But again, you would need to check that for your area to see if you're even able to make a decision based on that information that you get. Rental history verification. This is again comes back to the rental screenings and whether or not an address, for instance, is listed on their application or it's not listed on their application, but that it comes up as an address for a on their screening. One of the times we had an applicant that put in an application and they did not list a address. It came up on the screening, and so I just reached out and asked them, "Hey, this address didn't show up. Just wanted to see why is this address showing up and it wasn't on your application?" And they said, "Well, it was a roommate scenario, but I wasn't actually on the lease." Okay, so you were an unauthorized occupant at a rental property. Now, that may not necessarily be a make or break deal on whether I'm going to prove them or not, but it is something to be aware of that, okay, this person is clearly okay with being an unauthorized occupant on a lease that they have nothing to do with. And so maybe they're going to have the same thing at their rental property and have somebody who hasn't been screened and is living at the rental property. So just things to be keeping in mind for things that come up that, again, don't necessarily jump out at you right away, but that you should probably pay attention to when you see them. Employment verification. You can get employment verification when they list their employment information. A lot of companies these days actually even have online portals where you can actually submit a request. A lot of them do not allow that information any other way. And so you can go into the portal and the employee gives you like a number or a code and you put it in and it verifies the status of their employment. For smaller employers, that's probably not going to be the case if it's a local company. But there are plenty of ways that you can get employment verification information. And we're actually going to go over some income verification information in a minute. Reference checks. It is usually a good idea to put on reference checks to make sure that a person is who they say they are and whether or not they are referred by other people. This also helps if you can just have your existing tenants refer good tenants to your rental property. So if you already have tenants that are great tenants, why not reach out to them as part of marketing for your rental properties to get them to refer other tenants by offering bonuses to them or commissions or whatever you want to call it, or credits to their account if they refer qualified tenants. And in some states, in Texas, for instance, in Austin, sometimes I was paying as high as 150 to 200% to apartment locators just to get tenants in the door because it was a highly competitive market. And in some areas, it still is. So if I'm going to pay 150 to 200% to a locator to bring in a complete stranger as an applicant to my rental property, why wouldn't I do the same with my existing tenants and offer some amazing credit to their account to refer a tenant who I know is probably going to have a much higher likelihood of being qualified and being a good tenant because this other great tenant is a friend or a family member of this person. So something to keep in mind for not just reference checks on applications, but just referrals in general from people that you already are familiar with at your rental property can be a huge benefit. Eviction and court records searches. These are important because a lot of tools that can be used online, and even if you go to your local courthouse, a lot of them are not going to access national records. They're only going to access local or state records. And so it's important in this day and age when people tend to live all over the place and it's rather easy to move from one state to another and to just pick up and go. And it's rather common these days to be doing national eviction and court record searches, not just individual state or local, even county, by just going to your local county courthouse. Yes, a lot of that information is free if you go to those local places and you can put in free requests, a lot of times even online in some of those places, but most of them are not generating national reports. Fair housing laws and tenant screening. Landlords must be aware of fair housing laws and their implications for tenant screenings. It prohibits discrimination based on protected characteristics such as race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, and familial status. And so here are some things to consider regarding fair housing. Equal treatment. You must apply screening criteria consistently to avoid discrimination, and your screening criteria needs to be extremely clear, objective, and uniformly applied, irrespective of protected characteristics. And so you need to make sure that you are applying your policies for your application and screenings across the board evenly. And if for whatever reason that decision-making process is out of your control, as if you are managing a rental property for a third-party property owner, and let's say the property owner overrides your decision for a particular applicant because you are making your decision based on a uniform approach, then you should probably get that documented in writing from the owner so that at the end of the day, if it comes back to bite you, it doesn't bite you, it bites the owner or whoever the person is involved in the decision-making process who may have overridden your decision. That was the case for many years where I would manage a lot of third-party rentals, and there were some owners that would override my decisions. And so I always made sure that I got that documented in writing because I did not want to have to deal with that down the road. So it's very important. And I have been at rental properties where I have seen property managers and owners be investigated for this right here. It actually happens a lot more frequently than what you may think. In fact, they literally flew people in from Washington, D.C. for an entire week, and they went through the entire property's documents. Everything that was in writing, anything that was recorded was analyzed with a microscope as a result of this one particular investigation. And so it's very, very important to make sure you're following this particular thing. Reasonable accommodations. Landlords are required to make reasonable accommodations for applicants or tenants with disabilities, even during the screening process. This may involve modifying criteria or procedures to ensure equal access to housing. So this could be things like providing some type of braille or recorded version of your application if the person is blind and cannot see, or having somebody sit down and go over it with them or something along those lines. It could mean any number of things, and it's important that you're aware that the responsibility lies on you in many circumstances to make sure that you are providing reasonable accommodations. Criminal background checks. While landlords do have the right to conduct criminal background checks in most places, that's changing as we've discussed. Blanket policies that disproportionately affect certain protected groups may be considered discriminatory. So this could look any number of ways. So it's just important to pay attention and make sure that you are not in violation of being discriminatory in any way towards any particular group. There are potential fair housing exemptions. Now, I will be honest, I almost didn't include this in this presentation because there's a lot of ifs and buts and whats, and there's also a lot of places that even override these exemptions. There are some states that don't even allow for these loopholes in some states and cities anymore. And so I almost didn't cover it, but I figured that if anybody were to come to this webinar and then after the fact start researching anything, you'd probably come across this and be like, why didn't he cover this? This isn't even applicable to me. So we're going to go over it briefly. There are very limited exemptions to fair housing laws, such as the Mrs. Murphy exception for owner-occupied rentals, exemptions for senior housing, and religious organization accommodations. For instance, if a property owner rents out units in a building that they also reside in and it contains 4 or fewer units and they are an occupant of one of those 4 or fewer units, they may be exempt from certain provisions of the Fair Housing Act. This is known as the Mrs. Murphy exception, named after a hypothetical small-scale landlord. Single-family homes sold or rented without a real estate broker. Owners who rent or sell single-family homes without using the services of a real estate broker are exempt from certain fair housing provisions. The exemption does not apply if discriminatory advertising, however, is used in the process of selling or renting the property, or if the owner owns more than 3 single-family homes and does not live in any of them. Housing for older persons, of course, there are senior citizen properties that are fully within legal rights to rent out to age 55 and older, and other similar properties like that. And religious organizations, certain accommodations are provided for religious organizations that provide housing exclusively to individuals of the same religion under the religious exemption clause. However, it is important to note that exemptions, again, can vary depending on jurisdictions, and other laws may still be applicable. So it's important that you know what's going on in your area. Again, that's the reason why I almost didn't cover these 4 things, because some of these actually aren't even legal or they're even tighter restrictions to qualify for these things in some states and cities now. Strategies and tools for better rental screenings. So we've already gone over all of the best practices and the things that you might want to be looking for and keeping an eye out for, the things that you can do, the things that you can't do, and the things that maybe you just shouldn't do, or at least be aware of and be cautious of, and the risks involved of making mistakes in the rental application and screening and decision-making process. So now it's time to jump into some of the tools and strategies that can help us do those things better. For one, rental listing websites is a platform that allows you to reach, obviously, a huge amount of prospective tenants. And a lot of these platforms, including TenantCloud, offer built-in screening tools such as pre-screening questionnaires that help filter out unqualified applicants. And the TenantCloud application actually allows you to do that. It's fully customizable. You can ask your own questions. You can make questions yes or no. You can make them a combination of yes and no, or written answers depending on the response. You can make certain fields hidden or visible or required or optional based on the individual needs of your rental property. And the reason that we design our application like that is, again, because not every area is the same. And so one landlord in Texas may not have the same restrictions as a landlord in New York or California or Oregon or Portland or wherever. And so it's important to have flexibility around the rental application so that you are not asking questions that you're actually not allowed to ask in the first place, and should not be used in your area as part of the decision-making process, even as a pre-screening question. And by asking pre-screening questions, you can also help tenants save time and money, and yourself. If you're, for instance, your income requirement is 3.5 times the monthly rent, and somebody said, you ask a question, what is your average monthly income? And they put on there that they make $2,500 a month, but your rent is $1,000. Well, chances are that doesn't sound like they would probably qualify for your rental property, so they would probably be better off looking elsewhere for a rental. That's just one example of many examples, but pre-screening is a good idea. And that's what we talked about at the very beginning of this webinar when I said that it's usually recommended that you allow applicants to submit the application so that you can review it and then request a screening once you have viewed those pre-screening questionnaires and filtered out the applicants that aren't going to be approved based on the information they provided to begin with. Online rental applications. Implementing online rental applications simplifies the process for both landlords and applicants. They can be accessed, completed, and submitted electronically, reducing paperwork and streamlining the screening process. Again, TenantCloud offers that, as do a lot of platforms. And you have that online rental application until it is deleted. And you can also export it. You can save it on an external hard drive. You can print it and keep a hard copy if you need to in your particular area. And you want to make sure that you are keeping all of the necessary paperwork for as long as it is required. In some areas, that is 2 years. In some areas, that is 4 years. So you want to make sure that you are retaining your records for as long as is legally required in your area so that you can reduce your risk. If somebody applies for a rental property today and you delete that rental application in a week, and you made decisions based on that rental application, and the tenant comes back and files a complaint or lawsuit against you, and you don't have that rental application anymore to support your decision-making process to justify it by legal means, then you could be in a lot of hot water. So it's important to make sure that you are keeping track of rental applications and you are retaining rental applications for as long as is required. Tenant screening services. Utilizing professional tenant screening services provides comprehensive nationwide background checks, as we touched on earlier, as well as credit reports, eviction history, and other relevant information. These services efficiently gather and analyze the data for you a lot of times, and they provide with detailed reports to aid in the decision-making process, including what we talked about before, where instead of something like a traditional FICO score from one of the FICO models, it might be an actual tenant score that is usually a proprietary algorithm used by the various bureaus to generate a tenant-specific score, not just a regular FICO score. Online background check platforms offer quick and convenient access to criminal records and other public records. Landlords can use these platforms to conduct thorough background checks. You can do that on TenantCloud. You can actually request either a background or a credit check or a combination of both. And we also offer an income insights, which, if you're not familiar with it, we just recently released this on the TenantCloud platform. We touched on briefly about the issue of fake pay being becoming a more common issue, and it is. If you go on any landlord or property manager forum on any website in the United States where those conversations are taking place, it is a huge issue, and some people unfortunately don't catch it. And a lot of it is manual. You have to look at the pay stubs very closely sometimes and find the red flags that show you that this is a fake pay stub. This is a fake, whatever financial document you require, 1099, W-9, whatever it is. And so it's important that you have some type of verification of whether or not the income is matching what the tenant is reporting on the application. And so Income Insights does just that. As it becomes more common to encounter fraudulent income information on rental applications, even fake pay stubs, you want to get some type of sense of whether that reported income is accurate. And the Income Insights report basically says, it gives you essentially a score basically of, okay, the tenant said they're making $3,000 and it looks like they might be making more or less, or that is approximately the amount that they probably do make. And it gives you, it's basically trying to think of the correct word, but basically a confidence score essentially of yes or no, the tenant is most likely being honest, or no, the tenant may not be being honest. And that would mean that you would want to dig in deeper and maybe do an employment verification form that you send off, or call the employer and verify their employment, etc. So this is becoming a huge problem, which is why we have introduced this. And it's not a problem unique to TenantCloud at all. It is a problem across the board on all platforms and property managers and landlords across the country. And so it is important to be able to get some sense of whether the information being provided by the tenant is accurate or not. So you definitely might want to take a look at the Income Insights tool on the TenantCloud platform. It's included in the screening flow. When you go to do a screening, it'll ask you if you want to add on the Income Insights tool to get a better idea of whether the tenant's income is being accurately reported or not. Document management systems. We talked about this a little bit ago, making sure that you are retaining the necessary data for privacy and data protection regulations, which again is another hot topic that continues to get hotter and hotter in the United States. And I imagine that there will be even more strict laws coming into play down the road in the not too distant future. And so it's important to have the best practices and not just wait for those things to happen, but to start now, because your region may already have some of those more strict requirements in place already, whether you realize it or not. And so you want to make sure that you are retaining all of the necessary documentation as it relates to managing your rental property. That is not just applications and screenings. That's everything. That's leases. That's maintenance requests. That's screening reports. That's identification documents if they were provided as a part of the application process from your prospective tenants, and so on. Communication and collaboration tools. Utilizing communication and collaboration tools such as email, messaging apps, or project management platforms helps and track communication with applicants and other stakeholders involved in the screening process. I touched on this a little earlier about, especially for those who manage properties that are owned by third parties and you are managing on their behalf, and perhaps they override your decision-making process. It is important to have efficient and organized communication, ensuring transparency and accountability to make sure that if something does jump out of the dark at you 6 months from now, that you have it well documented how that decision was made, why it was made, and who made it. That is extremely important. And not just that, but also the communication regarding that decision-making process. So if you have somebody on your team who is perhaps involved in the screening process, you would probably want to have a lot of those conversations through TC Messenger so that it is a conversation that is documented and could be exported out of the TenantCloud system and stored outside via physical format if necessary. For instance, if you have to bring it to court. That type of information those types of communications can take place through TC Messenger, so you can collaborate with those on your team. If you were not aware of that, TenantCloud has a team management tool so that you can add on people such as accountants, and maybe you even want to add an owner. They're super active and you want to just add them as a team member and set them up for their property if they're involved in some process on your account for their property still. There are some owners who are super active, and maybe it's an owner who does their own maintenance on their property, but they want you to handle all the collection and application and screening and marketing and all that stuff. You can set them up as a team member. Maybe you have a leasing agent, an assistant manager, whoever. You can set them up in TenantCloud, and you can communicate with them through TC Messenger in TenantCloud as well. It's important that you make sure that you select the technology and tools that, of course, align with your specific needs, budget, and legal requirements. They can save you time, improving decision-making, and enhancing the overall efficiency and effectiveness of your rental screening process. So that pretty much wraps this up. Tenant screening, again, is extremely important to find reliable, responsible, and suitable tenants while maintaining compliance with fair housing laws and other laws in your area. And they can protect not just your financial interests, but they can protect your properties, your tenants, and make sure that you are complying with legal requirements. And they can also foster positive relationships with your current and future tenants, which is why, again, trust is essential, but verification ensures peace of mind and a successful rental experience for both, or rather all parties involved. So that pretty much wraps up the presentation portion. Hopefully the information that has been shared is valuable. I'm going to go through here and let's see if I come across any questions that have been asked as a part of this webinar presentation. I do see one. Yes, this is being recorded. And yes, you will be able to access it via the same link that you used to join it in the first place. And you will also be able to access this on our TenantCloud YouTube channel, where you'll also find a bunch of our previous webinars, podcasts, FAQ videos, interviews with the founder of TenantCloud, and so on. So yes, definitely you'll have access to this after the fact. Let's see if there are any other questions that have come across. Let's see. A potential tenant has come to me, but this tenant does not have income, but they are currently searching for work. Am I allowed to turn them away? So, I mean, that's more of a decision that you would have to make as far as any fair housing laws or anything of that nature, assuming they don't have any other source of income. I don't think that there would be a reason why they could not be declined. There are some states and there are a lot of areas now that you have to treat other forms of income as or other forms of financial resources as income. And that includes things like housing voucher programs. Some states have now included that as a protected source of income, and you cannot make a decision in those areas based on how they are going to be paying for the rental property. So if that's the case, and they have other source of income, or they have a savings account with money in it that can pay for the rental property, those may be red flags that you might need to look into further in your area to see if you're even allowed to make a decision based on those. In the state of Texas, typically, let's say if somebody has a savings account that has like 10 times the amount of the monthly rent, and they just move to the state, then that is something where a lot of property managers will still approve the prospective tenant. I don't know that there's a legal law in the state of Texas on that, but I just know I've been in the property management industry for over a decade, and a lot of property managers will not decline a person if they have that amount of savings on hand, or if they have a income that can be used from, let's say, like they're attending college and their scholarship includes some type of housing voucher. Again, a lot of states have started to include those types of things as a form of income, and you cannot decline based on those things in some areas. So again, it really just comes down to your particular area and what you are allowed to include or not include in your decision-making process, and whether or not they even have those additional sources of financial resources to be able to pay rent to begin with. As a landlord, I've spoken to so many landlords who have no one to ask. Unfortunately, too many make uninformed. I totally agree, which is one of the reasons why we host these webinars. And thank you for answering that question to Lisa. I think it's extremely important. And we do have a TenantCloud Facebook community as well, where we totally encourage those conversations to take place. And if you are not a member of that community, certainly request to join the TenantCloud Facebook group, where a lot of those conversations also take place. So definitely helpful to have a community that you can reach out to, especially for new landlords in the rental management industry. Let's see here. Any other questions? Did you say that TenantCloud has the ability for nationwide background checks? Yes, it does, absolutely. So you can do a nationwide background check and credit check, and it's going to pull up all available public information from as many public resources as possible. That's done through TransUnion. A similar product that they offer directly, I think, is called Smart Move or something along those lines. Which is our product is with TransUnion is very similar to that product. So that is the screening that you will be able to process on TenantCloud. Let's see. And you can also do those separately. I think I mentioned that in the presentation. You can actually do a credit check separate from a background check if you want to, or you can do it combined. If you've never used a TenantCloud screening before, reach out to your sales representative. If you don't have one, feel free to just reach out through support. And if you have never done a TenantCloud screening, reach out and we'll be happy to see if we can get you connected with a discount off of your first screening, just so you can get a sense of what those screenings look like. But we have thousands and thousands of landlords and property managers that process screenings through TenantCloud on a regular basis. So it's a pretty thorough report that you get. How about criminal background, such as felony over 10 years ago? Can I deny them and go with another person without criminal background? Again, that's more of a legal question that you're going to want to check with somebody who has the legal authority to speak on that. In terms of my experience over the past 10 years, no, we would not make a decision. Actually, we wouldn't even make a decision for anybody who had a felony older than 5 years, unless it was something extreme like murder, which most people aren't out of prison for murder anytime soon. But no, in the state of Texas over the past 10 years, we wouldn't decline anybody if a felony was older than 5 years, unless, again, it was something extreme. And so, but it depends on your area. So you're going to want to speak with somebody who can speak with more authority on that in your particular state and city. I'm not sure if there's a time frame on whether or not you're allowed to make a decision there. In my company, we view screening as the first step only to determine if we proceed to additional steps. Screening keeps you from spending a lot of time on additional steps. Yes. And that's typically referred to in the property management industry as pre-screening, which we touched on in the presentation. And I totally agree. Pre-screening is the most important step to determine whether or not you're going to proceed with doing the actual screening on that applicant. So the pre-screening would make sure that you have gotten all the necessary information. It's usually the basic information before even proceeding with anything else. And yes, federal law requires that you have a written criminal background policy. And again, we touched on that in the presentation as well, that it needs to be in writing, well documented, and provided to the prospective tenant at the time that they inquire about applying for the rental property. They need to get that criteria right away. Again, that's where you want to make sure that that information is clearly listed somewhere on the rental application process, or maybe even in your listing, or it's something that you send people before you process the screening, whatever it is. We would actually get it signed and dated by prospective tenants as a part of the application process. So we could not process a screening if we did not have the screening criteria document signed and dated, and that included the criminal background policy. We also had a credit screening policy that was clearly laid out as well. So I think that's all the questions we've had come through, and it is 10:52, so we're definitely well over the time frame that we set aside for this webinar, but hopefully, again, the information that you have received as a result of this webinar has been helpful. And this is, again, recorded. You can access it with the same link you used to join, and you can also access it on our YouTube channel. Our team should have it uploaded sometime this week to our TenantCloud YouTube channel. And we certainly appreciate all of the engagement and all the questions that have been asked, and people jumping in and helping answer some of those questions. And we look forward to seeing you not only on the TenantCloud platform, but also hopefully you'll consider joining us on the TenantCloud Facebook community as well. And we'd love to see you there. So again, thanks for joining. My name is Chris, and I'll look forward to talking with you next time.